afternoon, dear students and colleagues. We are here today for a discussion on higher education and research in a globalizing world. I have with me Professor Klaus Steerstopher, and before we begin the discussion, I would like to introduce him. Professor Steerstopher is a professor of English at the University of Münster in Germany. He has studied at the universities of Regensburg and Oxford, from where he has received his DPhil degree, and he had earlier also trained as a secondary school teacher and then started his career as a professor at the University of Würzburg in Germany, from where he moved to take up a full professorship at the University of Düsseldorf in 2004, and since after that he has been in Münster. He has several publications to his credit. He is his research interests are in Victorian writing. He has written books on comedy. He has written on other Victorian subjects, and he has got a very substantial 6-volume set of edited works on women writing home. He is, in addition to being a professor at the University of Münster, he is also a Senate member at that university. He's a vice dean and chair of literature, and as though all that was not enough, he is also the vice president of the German-Canadian Literature Association and has served on several high-level committees in Germany and abroad. Welcome, Professor Steerstopher, to this discussion.
Thank you for welcoming me here in Gujarat. I'm very pleased to be here.
And what brings you here?
You first of all, and the very interesting educational environment in Gujarat, both on the secondary school level, but also at the university level. I will be going to a conference in Bhuj tomorrow on constructions of home, a cooperation with that university, with the English department, which we've begun to organize. Thinking about Gujarat and education, I find that this is, as it were, a growth market. In Europe, it's a changing market. Gujarat is, in my perception, developing fast, and for me, it's a very interesting environment to learn, mainly how things are developing in this part of the world, and to come to mutual benefits from this insight.
I'm sure this would be of interest to our viewers, and if I might ask you for your views on the current educational scenario in Germany. I understand it's a fast-changing scenario, so if you could tell our viewers about that, I'm sure they'd be interested.
Yes, well, I suppose the two most important, perhaps the three most important, historically speaking, the three most important developments were, first of all, they've cut spending on education in Germany drastically. Although Germany is a fairly well-off country still, despite all the financial problems worldwide, it spends a very small percentage, comparatively speaking, of its gross national product on education, one has to say. And that was further cut some years ago, which led to huge problems in the educational sector, especially in the universities, but also in the schools. And something had to be done about it. The government then, first of all, decided to give a little bit of the money they were spending back. They had been cutting back in the form of what they called an initiative of excellence. That initiative of excellence meant basically that universities and departments could apply and say we are excellent, and if they convinced a central selection committee, they could or can get substantial amounts of money. Nowhere near the kinds of monies that were cut, but still this was an idea to further competition and to create many German Harvards and Yales. I'm not a judge to say how successful that was. We're all being very skeptical. about it. But this is an important development in our educational system. And the third important thing is, I don't know whether viewers here would be familiar with the fact that until very recently, university education in Germany was entirely free. There was no charge at all, both for Germans and for people from abroad, and they've now mildly changed that by charging very moderate fees per semester, but that has, well, led to some substantial fighting between students and authorities, and
they are unhappy.
Oh yes, and some ideological. It's that was a very deeply ingrained ideological. Given that in Germany all university education had to be free, secondary education anyway, that's never been a question.
Well, here in India, it's very highly subsidized university education, and at school level we have different sectors where we have government-aided schools and we have private schools, and at private schools our students pay much more than they do at the government-aided schools. But I think this is also changing in India, and I think at some point in time students might find themselves having to pay much more for higher education than they do today, and the higher education scenario, as we know, is changing rapidly, and we have a lot of private universities coming in. And private universities would mean students would have to pay their full fees, not the kind of subsidized fees that you have been talking about. But could I go to the topic of our discussion today, which is higher education and research? So if you could tell us a little bit about the higher education and research scene in Germany today.
Well, that is very closely linked to what I said just now, this initiative of excellence. I think overall there's a tendency to reduce covering by funding, standard funding procedures. So each professor gets a certain budget, things like that, to a much more competitive schedule and system. So that as even a chair, you get very little research funds in the first place and have to compete for that more and more. That has some advantages, but perhaps more disadvantages, meaning that who eventually then decides what the projects are which are to be supported. And then, of course, you come to peer reviewing and things like that. But everyone involved in peer reviewing will have their, let's say, mixed experiences of this process. So that I think the very perhaps almost pampered German professorship over the decades since the 1960s, when they were very well endowed and through the student movement then, feels the pinch at the moment very much.
Well, I think Indian professors have never been a very pampered lot, and we have never had any research funds attached to our chairs like you have in Germany. So in that sense, if we want to do research or any projects, we have to apply for grants. And we also have this kind of grants for projects which are in the area of excellence. So we have some similarities there. But could I ask you about the kind of areas in which research is being done, or the kind of areas which gets the major research funding in Germany today?
Well, obviously, and I think Germany is not unique there. The major funds go into the natural sciences, medical sciences, or life sciences, applied sciences, engineering, and there's a little bit left sometimes for the humanities where I work, which we sometimes see with some regret, but on the other hand, as long as it's enough for everyone, or would be enough for everyone, we'd be happy. I do see that physicists and so on need perhaps a lot more for, I don't know.
And they get a lot more money
and
as well.
They do get a lot more all the time,
it's the same here in India, because the humanities and the social sciences do have lower research funding than do the science areas. But as you say, they do need a lot more money as well. Could I lead this discussion on to joint research, because apart from research needing to be interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary today, not just restricted to our own areas of study, research also is moving out across national boundaries and barriers to moving into areas where somebody from Germany can have a joint research project with somebody in India, for instance. So could we talk about that a little? Because we could maybe inform our viewers that the two of us do have a joint research project.
That brings us to the topic of
Yes.
the first example, and perhaps I take the opportunity of introducing you, as the viewers will not perhaps, although they should of course be familiar with your research profile and your perhaps recent work. So let me, dear viewers, perhaps say a few words about Professor Niloufar Bharucha, who is a professor of English at the University of Mumbai, and she is there the coordinator for the Group for Research on the Indian Diaspora, a UGC project under the university with potential for excellence scheme. I note the word excellence here in India as well, with some sarcasm almost, and for the Indo-Canadian Studies Centre, funded by the British Columbia province in Canada. Professor Bharucha has studied at the universities of Bombay and Manchester. Her areas of specialization are post-colonial literatures and theories, the writings of the Parsis. I may perhaps add that you are yourself of Parsi origin, the literature
And at home in Gujarat.
and at home in Gujarat. Well, the literature of the Raj and Indian cinema. She has co-edited 3 books and has authored a monograph on Rohinton mysteries fiction. Her articles and reviews have appeared in Western and Indian academic journals
I think they get the
and
picture.
in critical
Yes.
anthologies. Well, there's so much more to say. It's very humble of you to cut me short here. But what I specifically, I think, want to emphasize, and coming back to your initial remark, was the cooperation we started. And I think that's perhaps not a leading example, but a possible example of sometimes how makeshift, but still, from my point of view, very successful such initiatives can be. And perhaps this can also be an encouragement for such kinds of cooperations between European countries and India. Our cooperation mainly, and I think it has been already on a number of subjects, which I'd like to stress. Remember, we began with questions of cultural translations at a conference in Münster.
Right.
At Düsseldorf.
At Düsseldorf.
And we then went on, once I had moved on to Münster, on collaborating mainly on questions of fundamentalism and literature. We had thought about this project mainly in, I'd say, European, traditional, historically European contexts. And we then had this common conference on the topic in Mumbai. And that opened an entirely new perspective to me, coming and discussing and talking about this topic in an Indian context, beginning with the problem, I remember, which you had stressed, that we couldn't call it a conference on fundamentalism and something in India. Otherwise, it might be problematic. It might have a different context of understanding in the Indian culture as it would have in the
And
German.
I think starting from there, we have moved on to other joint research. We have done papers together, and although Professor Steerstopher hasn't still come over to the University of Mumbai as a visiting professor, I've spent some time in Munster. And that kind of interaction with students, I think, is also very important for understanding the world, for giving us a different perspective, a different worldview. Teaching students in India and teaching students in Germany, for instance, gives me a different perspective on my own areas of critical concern, which is post-colonial literatures. Teaching the writing of the Parsis in Germany is different from teaching it at Mumbai University, for instance. So all that has sort of gone into the experiences that we have built up as a research teaching kind of partnership between the University of Munster and the University of Mumbai. This has been a learning experience.
Can we add perhaps that, talking about supplementation, that we've now added the University of Łódź as one of our partners, and we are together joining a conference there on the constructions of home or reconstructions of home, a project I have already looked at again in a European or European American context, and from the program I'm already very curious to see what new refractions we get on the topic here in this interesting cultural constellation in Gujarat. Very exciting topic culturally and also from a literary perspective.
Yes, and I think that's another joint research project which Professor Steerstopher is building up with the University of Kutch, and of course in Kutch, where there is a long tradition of people moving from Kutch to different parts of the world. A lot of the Indian diaspora comes from the Kutch region, so that should throw up a lot of interesting ideas about how the Kutchis look at this whole construct of home. So that's something I think both of us are looking forward to, this conference at Bhuj, the University of Kutch. But another question I'd like to ask you would be possible teacher-initiated